Dr. Mathew Nelson teaches at the School of Oriental and African Studies. He's an area specialist. He has specialized in Pakistan. He speaks Urdu fluently. He's visited Pakistan, traveled across the country many times. And amongst Western writers, he's considered one of the academics who writes regularly on what is going on in Pakistan. So in this reading, Dr. Mathew Nelson wants to examine the major right-wing political parties or religious political parties in Pakistan. And he looks mainly at two of the most important political parties, religious political parties. One is, of course, the Jamiat Ulema Islam, which is the largest political party. And the other is the Jamaat Islami, which can be considered the most influential political party. Before I begin to talk about what the different political parties are that Mathew Nelson is looking at and what he's, how he looks at them, I think it's important to know what he's trying to do in this essay. He's not trying to do a chronological view of the various Islamic movements in Pakistan. That's not his objective. His objective actually is to gauge what kind of politics the Islamic political parties do in Pakistan. Are they mainly parties like the Ennahda, which is involved mainly in electoral politics? Are they parties that are like the GLA in Algeria, which are mainly fighting an armed struggle? Are they other forms? What are the forms of struggle that they are undertaking? That's what he's trying to look at. How are they able to access the political arena? What are the tools they're able to use to access the political arena and change Pakistani society? So that's the central question that he is looking at. So he says the precursors of the Jamaat Islami and the Jamiat Ulema Islam opposed efforts by Muhammad Ali Jinnah and his broadly, in inverted commas, secular Muslim League to create a Muslim majority state known as Pakistan. Why does he put secular in inverted commas? Because, of course, the Muslim League was also flirting with various ulema and making statements that can be interpreted to mean that Pakistan was going to be an Islamic state, etc., etc. So it wasn't fully secular in that sense. And of course, most importantly, its identity was based on Muslim nationalism. A secular party would not say that it represents Muslims, it would say that it represents everyone. So in that sense, he puts secular in inverted commas. But it is a historical fact, nonetheless, that the Jamaat Islami at that time, as well as the Deobandi ulema mainly, did not support Muhammad Ali Jinnah or the Muslim League. There were some ulema that did support the Muslim League naturally, and we have often heard their names and mentioned them, etc. But the bulk and the majority of the ulema actually did not support the Muslim League. This may be shocking for a lot of people to hear. And these days, when you put something of this sort out on the internet, you immediately get a response from the Jamaat Islami saying, no, you're not telling the truth, etc., etc. But I looked at the documentation, and what Mathew Nelson is saying is absolutely correct. However, once Pakistan was created, they began to argue that Pakistan was created only and only for Islam. They often say, for example, if you just wanted to have a secular society, why did you not stay in India? If you just wanted to build a secular state, then it was better for us to have stayed in India. The whole purpose of creating Pakistan was to create a Muslim state. Of course, the Muslim League at that time used to say, we didn't stay in India because Congress was never, and we did not consider it a secular party. The point of view of the Muslim League was that Congress is a Hindu party. This is something that the Qaid said again and again, over and over again. But anyway, in their view, Congress was a secular party, and therefore, if Pakistan was not meant for Islam, then we might as well have stayed in India. And since we've created Pakistan, it means that Pakistan was created to be a theocratic Islamic state. So within Pakistan's protracted constitutional debates, both parties, that is the JI and the JUI, claimed that the Muslim majority state envisioned by Jinnah would require careful oversight to avoid the introduction of any law that might be considered repugnant to the terms of Islam. And this is how they've managed to dominate over the intellectual discourse, even constitutional debates, the making of the constitution in the context of Pakistan, that they have been able to persuade a substantive number of people that the reason for the creation of Pakistan was that Pakistan was going to be an Islamic state, and therefore the proper guardians of that Islamic state would not be the Muslim League, which they have always claimed was never fully an Islamic organization anyway, but it would be the Jamaat Islami, it would be the JUI, or it would be the ulema, and so on. So now we see that despite the fact that they made this argument, and they were very crucial in the constitutional debates in Pakistan in the early period as well as in pretty much all periods, despite the fact that they were able to make this argument, they were never able to win any mainstream election at the national level as a whole. The Jamaat Islami in the 40s, in fact, used to very strongly say that the whole democratic system of voting and people's sovereignty is anti-Islamic. And they would even go to the extent of saying that anybody who casts their vote is doing something which is un-Islamic. But in the early 1950s, they began to change their view, because now that Pakistan had been created, I think they began to understand that they have to do something within the political setup of Pakistan. They have to get their voices heard within the parliament. And so they decided, Maududi Sahab decided that no, the party will participate in elections. This caused the first major split in the Jamaat Islami, with Amin Ehsan Islahi leaving the party and forming his own separate group. And in fact, Javed Ghamdi Sahab was very close to Amin Ehsan Islahi, but we'll talk about that later. Nonetheless, the Jamaat Islami was not able to, and neither was the JUI, able to win the national election. The marginalization, writes Mathew Nelson, of parties like the JI and the JUI was particularly apparent during the election of the 1970, when, having contested more than 150 seats, the JI won just 4 seats. The 1970 election is very, very crucial because the JI really fought the hardest in that particular election. And it seemed for a while that this was going to be an election, a kind of referendum between Maududi on the one hand and Bhutto on the other hand. And so, because each of them had two dramatically different programs. Bhutto was saying we're going to have socialism, and Maududi was saying we're going to have an Islamic state. And so this election was really a left-right contest now. And in that contest, the Jamaat Islami only won 4 seats. It was really, really terrible. The JUI fared somewhat better, winning 7 National Assembly seats out of 105 that it contested, and also 9 provincial seats. In fact, the JUI helped to form the provincial government in Balochistan, as well as in what was that time called the NWFP. And JUI leader Mufti Mahmood Saab emerged as NWFP's chief minister. And interestingly, this government that was created in the 1970 with the JUI had a coalition partner, and that coalition partner was the National Awami Party, which was one of the main left-wing parties of Pakistan. It was the party that, in fact, had the Communist Party of Pakistan, which had been banned in 1953. They had moved inside the National Awami Party. And the National Awami Party was allied to the JUI at this stage. The JUI and the Jamaat Islami's electoral fortunes peaked in 2002 at 11%. They've never gone higher than that. And then they declined right back down to 5%. In other words, through most of Pakistan's history, total votes cast in elections, the average number of votes that are cast for JI and JUI, the 2 biggest Islamic parties, are about 5% of the population. 95% of the population does not vote for religious political parties. Also, the Jamaat Islami has had declining fortunes, despite the fact that Mian Tufail supported Yahya's campaign against the Awami League, and Jamaat Islami supported Zia's Islamization. It supported its involvement in the anti-Soviet politics of Afghanistan. The Jamaat Islami and the state of Pakistan had very, very close relations, not only in the period of Yahya, but certainly in the period of General Zia. The JI then joined with the IJI, which was, it is said, created by the ISI. In fact, it's not really said. IJI was created by the ISI to counter the PPP. That became a very famous case called the Asghar Khan case. IJI got a lot of money from the ISI to counter the PPP. And in fact, you'll be interested to know that Osama bin Laden was also supporting the IJI at this point against the Pakistan People's Party, because they did not want Benazir to come to power. The right wing was totally against it. And I remember at that time, they used to continuously say that a woman can never be prime minister of a Muslim state because women are naqasul aql, and women should never, any society that is ruled by a woman will decline. Then came Qazi Hussain Ahmed. He tried to create a mass party, but he was also not successful. IJI was badly defeated by the People's Party in that election, in fact. The People's Party got 93 seats, and the IJI, which is a huge coalition, got 54 seats. And the Jamaat Islami in that election only got 8 seats. Then going further, in 93, the Jamaat Islami contested again. From 8, it went to only 3 seats. In 97, they said, we are not contesting in the election because elections are just corrupt. They did not contest at all. So they had 0 seats in 97. It was the PMLN, of course, that swept the 97 Wala election. And PMLN was and is a center-right party. There's no doubt that center-right has had its own voting bloc. It has its own appeal. But the far-right, the religious parties, have not had that same kind of appeal ever. So what you see is that in this period, from the 70s, the Jamaat Islami has continuously been declining. Its best period was actually in 2002. In 2002, the JI and the JUI came together and formed the Muttahida Majlis-e-Amal, the MMA, although people used to call it Mullah Military Alliance, MMA. And they were supported by Musharraf, and they in turn supported Musharraf. Because Musharraf at that time was against Nawaz Sharif, and he was against Benazir Bhutto, he was against the People's Party, and he was against the PMLN. So despite Musharraf saying that I'm all for enlightened moderation, and I'm a secular ruler, in fact, his closest allies were the MMA. And this is the high point of the MMA, of all the religious parties in their entire history. They got 45 seats, and they also formed the provincial government. They were the key allies of Musharraf in the passing of things, legislation like the PCO and the LFO, etc., etc. They tried to then introduce the Hisba Act in the context of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which was the idea that they would have a police force which would monitor public morality. It would make sure that women were wearing the burqa and so on and so forth, etc. People were doing their namaz, beards, all of that. But the Supreme Court immediately struck it down and said, no, this is outside of the purview of the Provincial Assembly to have such an act. It violates the rights that are there in the Constitution, so you cannot do it. They also tried to pass a bill which would punish apostasy by death and so on, but that also failed to pass the Standing Committee. So they were really not able to pass any effective legislation, and their whole focus was really only on passing Islamic legislation rather than solving bread and butter issues and material problems. So in 2008, after 6 years, when the election finally occurred, they were badly defeated. They only got 7 seats. From 45, they went to 7 seats. GI decided that they will not even run precisely because they knew that they didn't have a chance to really win any seats. And in 2013, they won another 15 odd seats. GI won about 4 seats. So you can see that voters were put off by the extent to which their religious policies failed to address their core material concerns. Voters didn't really necessarily like all this religious politics. They wanted people to solve their problems. And in fact, there was another factor in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa certainly, and that was Tehreek-e-Insaf and Imran Khan. Younger voters now, religious voters who would ordinarily vote for the JUI or would even vote for the Jamaat Islami, turned in a big way to vote for Imran Khan. In a huge way, they began to turn and start voting for Imran Khan. And so Imran Khan took away much of the vote bank of the religious parties in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which is one of the reasons why Maulana Fazlur Rahman has been so against the PTI and has been ready and willing to work with the PDM, although he has an uneasy relationship with them. But he was the one who was ready to lead the charge against PTI precisely because he lost a huge chunk of his vote bank to the Tehreek-e-Insaf. But beyond just elections, where the religious parties have never necessarily done very well, on average they get about 5% of the vote, is the other work that they do. For example, the work of dawa, which is very strong, Al-Khidmat and Al-Khair Trust, etc., going and proselytizing and teaching Islam. They also work on education. They've always been very key in the educational boards. Whichever government comes to power, they always have their people in the education board. So the syllabus is really, from the 80s onwards, really has the stamp of the Jamaat Islami on it. You can see that. And recently, when the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf was in power and they passed the single national curriculum, you also saw that the religious parties were able to shape the discourse on what the SNC would look like, what the single national curriculum would look like. Also, they are very media savvy and they are very heavily dominant on media, especially on the Urdu media, whether that's in print or now electronic media. For example, there was a time when I was growing up when Dr. Israr Ahmad used to come daily on Pakistan television to give us a lecture on what Islam is and isn't. And of course, Dr. Israr Ahmad is the original conspiracy theorist because everything that went wrong in the world went wrong because of Jews. That's what we used to learn from him when we were growing up. He created the Tanzeem-e-Islami and the Tehreek-e-Khilafat. You can sometimes see some rickshaws and the rickshaws say Tanzeem-e-Islami at the back. He was also part of the Jamaat Islami. He fell away from the Jamaat Islami precisely when Maulana Maududi and others decided that they will go into elections. Dr. Israr Ahmad says, no, an Islamic party cannot go into elections. Elections are all about corruption, etc. We are not engaging with elections. The other major figure that you see, especially in the Musharraf period was Javed Ahmad Ghamdi Saab. Ghamdi Saab was of the view that Maududi Saab has altered what Islam really stands for. Islam really stands for personal purification, changing yourself, and so on. It does not necessarily stand for a political program as such. And the politicization of Islam has been the cause of extremism, and it is also the cause of the downfall of Islam. So hence, we have to understand that in politics, we can argue with each other till the cows come home, etc. That has nothing to do with religion. Religion is about personal purification. It is about your personal ethics, etc. That's what it's all about. And you heard the point of view of Ghamdi Saab through Muhammad Hassan Ilyas, who came and did a guest lecture at LAMS. Finally, we also have the Tablighi Jamaat, which is hugely influential. They go door to door talking to people and saying, we are here to teach you about Islam. They also came to my house, etc. And they said, we're here to teach you about Islam. I said, all right, come on in, have a glass of water. And they saw a guitar in the corner. I said, what do you think about this guitar? And they said, well, maybe you should consult your own ulema about the guitar, etc. Because, of course, they also target specifically cricketers, celebrities, and musicians. And one of the biggest celebrities that they converted, to their point of view was Junaid Jamshed, who used to be the heartthrob of Pakistanis in the 1980s as the lead singer of Vital Signs. The third major aspect, aside from election being the first one and dawa work being the second one, is militancy. Mathew Nelson writes, what we see in Pakistan is actually a complex pattern in which the link between religious parties and Muslim militancy, including the link between mainstream parties like the JI or the JUI and militants with Jamaati or Deobandi affinities, is closely bound up with the work of the Pakistan Army. So militancy in Pakistan has developed out of a project that the army has undertaken. The army really has worked with the Jamaat Islami and worked with the Jamiat Ulema Islam to create these militants. The examples that he provides are Al-Badr Brigade in East Pakistan during the 1970s was really helped on by the military. The military was helping them. They were helping the military. The Hizb-e-Islami in Afghanistan was helped and created by the military. They got their arms, etc. from the military. They got their military training from the Pakistan Army. And the Hizbul Mujahideen, similarly, who fought in Kashmir after 1989, got their aid and assistance and training, etc. from the military. And of course, the most important of these organizations is the TTP. The TTP, as I've told you already, came into being after the Lal Masjid operation. And in retaliation to the Lal Masjid operation. The Lal Masjid operation resulted in lots and lots of casualties, naturally hundreds of casualties, and it was broadcast on television, and Musharraf was deeply unpopular at that time. So the Masood tribe decided that they are going, under the leadership of Baitullah Masood, that they're going to create a new militia called the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, as opposed to the Tehreek-e-Taliban Afghanistan, which had been going on since the 1990s. This was created in 2007. So TTA now became, in the view of the army, the good Taliban, because they were fighting in Afghanistan. They were the proxies of the Pak military. They were the assets that were still obeying what the Pak army was telling them to. They were still doing what the Pak army was telling them to do. And the TTP became the bad Taliban. The TTP were accused by the military of being funded really by India. But ironically, it was the Pakistan army that had trained the Masood militants who were fighting against the Pakistan army. Now, the United States of America began to help Pakistan against the TTP. And the Afghan government was actually also helping Pakistan against the TTP. They were arresting TTP operatives in Afghanistan, putting them in prison, etc. And the Pakistanis would feed intelligence to the Americans and tell them, oh my God, Baitullah Masood is over there. We have intelligence. Can you do a drone strike in that area and kill Baitullah Masood? And so that's what the Americans and the Pakistanis were up to. The Pakistanis would provide the ground intelligence about TTP operatives, and the Americans would send in their technology, the drone, and they would kill them. For example, Baitullah Masood was killed by a drone strike in Pakistan. After him, Hakim-ullah Masood took power. He was killed by a drone strike. Then Mullah Umar took power. He was supported both by the TTA and by the TTP. It turned out that he had died 2 years earlier. Nobody knew about his death. When his death came out, Mullah Akhtar Mansoor took over the Taliban. He was also killed by a drone strike in Pakistan. And then finally, Maulvi Haibatullah Akhundzada took the leadership of the Taliban. So you see that the Americans were really helping the Pakistani to destabilize, to hit at the TTP, etc. In the midst of all this, when in 2014, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi declared in Iraq that he is the Khalifa and that the Islamic State is already established, many people in the context of the border region as well as in Afghanistan, and many people who don't let it be known publicly, basically decided that they are going to support the ISIS. For example, Hafiz Saeed Khan of TTP pledged allegiance to Baghdadi, and out of that grew the ISIS Khorasan. The ISIS Khorasan is today now fighting the TTA in Afghanistan. So there are still bomb attacks going on in Afghanistan, despite the fact that the Taliban is in power. Previously, it was the Taliban that would do suicide bombings, etc. in Afghanistan. And now the suicide bombings and attacks and bomb attacks are being done against the Taliban by the ISIS Khorasan. It's a mess. And now there are even reports that the Americans are ready and willing to work to some extent with the Taliban to reverse the ISIS Khorasan. So it's a complete mess. Munawar Hassan of the Jamaat Islami at one point started to make statements that were very strongly supportive of the TTP. This meant, of course, that the Jamaat Islami and the army, their relations would worsen. And so Munawar Hassan, after a little while, was removed as the leader of the Jamaat Islami, and Sirajul Haq took his position. And he immediately began to distance himself from supporting the TTP. It also became obvious after Rahil Sharif's operation that the army would not work with any organization that was in any way defending the TTP. And so that would have risked the relations between the Jamaat-e-Islami and the army, relations with the Jamaat-e-Islami has inculcated and developed over the last 4 decades now. So they don't want to let those go. So finally, what Mathew Nelson is trying to teach us is that despite the religious parties not being able to win in the electoral arena, political Islam in the form of the JI and the JUI have a wide field of engagement, from elections on the one hand, where they get about 5% of the vote, to militant organizations, extremist organizations on the other, and dawa organizations in the middle. There's an array of tactical things that they are able to do to engage with Pakistani society and to change it in the direction that they want to change it in. Neither group is defined by either form of engagement. So neither the Jamaat-e-Islami nor the JUI is defined by elections or by dawa or by militancy. They do all three of them almost simultaneously and seamlessly. Even beyond elections and extremism, their affiliates are deeply involved in education, in televangelism, humanitarianism, civil society activism, and more. So no one strategy or tactic can therefore be associated with political Islam in Pakistan, according to Dr. Mathew Nelson.